In a world overflowing with distractions, we seek meaning. How do we transform ambition into something deeper, into true fulfillment? I'm Sam Pepin, CEO of Course Educa, and I've spent years helping businesses succeed by connecting their goals to something bigger. On the Meaningful podcast, we explore not just how to win in business, but how to grow as individuals. Through conversation with thought leaders, innovators, and everyday heroes, we uncover the stories that drive us towards something greater. Whether you're striving for success, seeking purpose, or just looking for the next steps in your journey, this podcast is your guide to navigating the intersection of ambition, growth, and meaning. So please join me and our incredible guests as we redefine what's possible in both business and life. Enjoy. A cave you fear to enter holds a treasure you seek. Welcome to the Meaningful Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Pepin, and today we're diving into personal transformation and healing, the intersection of science and spirituality, and building a purpose-driven business. Our guest today is Dexter Morton, the visionary founder and CEO of Chakra Wonders. A military veteran with a degree in biochemistry, Dexter overcame depression and financial hardship through meditation and spiritual exploration. This journey led him to create Chakra Wonders, a platform that empowers others to connect with their inner selves. He also hosts Onion Soup, a show that dives into the depth of consciousness and reality, offering inspiration through his profound personal transformation. If you enjoyed the discussion, please let the world know with a like, a small review, or even a quick share. Your support to help more people find meaningful content like this. Let's begin. Mr. Dexter Morton, welcome to the Meaningful Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful, Mr. Sam. It's a beautiful day here, and honestly, I'm just grateful to be here with you.
Absolutely. Well, we're glad to have you on here, and we've been having a personal and professional relationship as well, so I very value your work, and I think this conversation will be very insightful. First and foremost, tell us more about Chakra Wonders, your company. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, for sure. Chakra Wonders. Well, to tell you about the company, I feel like I really have to go with how I got started with everything, and the way that I got started was I used to be very angry, depressed, and sad, honestly. And it's funny, people who know me now don't believe me because I'm a very happy-go-lucky guy, but I just didn't really care for life. And I didn't know what I wanted. So I started trying to branch out and see what was available for me in the world. Joined the military and pursued a degree in science, have a degree in biochemistry. And none of it was really, I guess, what I wanted. And it wasn't really feeling that hole or that void that was within. So after having multiple panic attacks and anxiety attacks, my dad told me to sit down and meditate. And I didn't really know what that was at the time. So I researched it, and he taught me a few things. And I started to learn that there's a way to slow your mind down, to slow your heart rate down, and to come into more of a peaceful state of mind. And at the time, I was on blood pressure medication because my blood pressure was super high. And my doctor told me that if I didn't take the blood pressure, and I was in my early 20s when all this was happening. So my doctor told me that if I didn't take the blood pressure medication, I was at risk of having a heart attack in my 20s. And it was kind of ridiculous. And
Sure.
so I was taking it, and I didn't want to be on that for the rest of my life. Started to dive deeply, like I said, into meditation, holistic health, and alternative medicine. And I worked in the medical field. I've worked in medical for over 15 years, for nearly 15 years. And you just don't hear those things. Here in the Western world, we don't talk about herbology and holistic medicine, alternative medicine, and the things they can actually do for you. So fast forward, I go finish up my degree in biochemistry. I move out here to the beautiful Phoenix, Arizona. And I was actually on the verge of filling out the application to go get a PhD in neuroscience.
Mm.
And right before I did that, what I tell everyone is I heard but a voice. And I was about to hit submit on the application, and I realized that I was no longer angry. I was no longer sad. I was no longer depressed and anxious, and that I was really enjoying my life, and I didn't have really much to pay that to except for through meditation and through alternative medicine and being more holistic with my health. And I want to bring that to people. I want to show people that there is another way, there is another option. And I didn't know how to do that. So the first thing that I set out to do was to find merchandise to kind of promote the field that I was in. I was really into the chakras at the time, and I'm still very deep into chakras. I think it's very interesting. His name
Mhm.
Chakra Wonders. And I was going to these different metaphysical stores and different shops, and I couldn't really find things that I thought were very interesting or things that I wanted. A lot of times when you go to metaphysical stores, they have a lot of crystals and charms, necklaces, bracelets, and there's nothing wrong with those things. I have some as well, but that's not what I wanted. I wanted like everyday type of things. I wanted like a backpack, which is one of my favorite things actually, because I do a lot of traveling and do a lot of work. So I need something to carry my stuff in. So when I created Chakra Wonders, I decided to bring what I felt like an element of accessories and supplies that was missing in the metaphysical field. People who are interested in metaphysics, holistic health, and sciences, it's not just about the crystals and meditation. I mean, that's what it is. But we also want things to represent um, our field of study, our niche, you know? So like when you are, say if you're a Nike fan, you want Nike material, you know? So if you're an Apple fan, you get Apple products. So why is it that when we start studying and researching metaphysics and philosophy, there's really nothing that supports that? So that's when I created Chakra Wonders. So at Chakra Wonders, all of our supplies and accessories are related to metaphysics, astrology, philosophy, and lost my train of thought.
Nice. Take us back to the beginning of this. You were talking about this void. You were talking about perhaps a pursuit for meaning. How would you put that in words? The beginning of not only the quest of finding it, which I think you outlined quite well, but spiritually, how does that unfold for you?
Ooh, so for me, the unfolding was it's like a jagged road at best. I think when people think about the mindfulness journey and the holistic journey, they think it's a straight path, and it's nothing like that. It's filled with twists and turns. So I didn't really have much of a guide. And nowadays, I do help people on this journey when people need it. Upon request, I do one-on-ones and stuff like that. But I didn't have that. I did a lot of research and a lot of reading. I call myself a scientist at heart, you know. So I need to find the scientific backing for everything to the best of my ability and to the best of modern day science. When I first got started, it really just started with an inquiry. What is this? I know that there are people whom are had to have gone through what I'm going through as far as the depression and the anger, and they make it out, but a lot of people go to therapy. I tried therapy. It worked, but it still wasn't really what I was looking for. And I've always been interested in the brain and the mind, which is why I was going to go into neuroscience. So I knew that cortisol was really the main hormone when we talk about stress. So, and I also knew that there are natural ways to bring down your cortisol levels. So that's really where I started. I started with researching what was happening internally within my body from a biological perspective. And then what can I do to offset that without utilizing medicine as far as like pills and things like that. So that's really where my holistic journey began. I didn't even know that it was holistic health. I didn't know that it was alternative medicine. That was something I didn't really come across until I started talking about it with other people. I just knew that I didn't want to be on medication for the rest of my life. So I started to adjust my diet. And people would say that, and the crazy thing about it was I wasn't unhealthy. you know, I always, in my mind, I thought ate very healthily, but I always ate a lot of sugar, and I drank a lot of alcohol at the time, and it was, which a lot of soldiers do. Not that it's a good thing, but I drank tons and tons of alcohol. That was really where my, I guess the way that I was pacifying my own depression. And I didn't realize that I was doing so. And I remember going to a therapist and we are talking about alcoholism. And I didn't think that I was an alcoholic, and a therapist didn't either. But then when I started really researching what alcoholism was, I was like, well, I think that I am, because I wouldn't go more than a few days without alcohol. So I started figuring out what is addiction, you know, what hormones are released in the brain that supply our addiction. And, we always go back to like dopamine and things like that, or whatever, and neuronorepinephrine. But how do we offset that? So this is really where my path started. And then it really starts to lead you down. What book did I read that opened my mind to everything? It must have been the autobiography of a yogi. That was a really good one, as well as Eastern Body, Western Mind. That was the first one. So Eastern Body, Western Mind was the one that really, really introduced me to chakras. And that was the book that my dad put into my hand. And it starts talking about how certain emotions actually release certain hormones in the mind. And it doesn't really go that deep into it, but I was already aware from a biological standpoint what hormones actually affect your body and emotions and stuff like that. So reading Eastern Body, Western Mind was a way for me to make a connection from a biological standpoint to what was happening to me emotionally. And because I was able to make that connection, I could see how certain types of meditation, certain types of, I don't really want to say alternative medicine, certain types of herbs, certain types of foods affected your body. And clearly alcohol isn't good for you, but you still need something to fill that void, right? Because you're using the alcohol to fill the void, which is why you became, or why I became, addicted to it, and why we have our addictions. So once you remove that, what are you going to fill this void with? Because you're left with this gaping hole that's almost in your soul, which it is. And I learned that later. But, you feel like there's this gaping hole in your soul. So what do you do? So that's when I started filling it in with, for me, education. For me, it was knowledge. And as I learned more, I started to want to express these thoughts with people, because people would ask me, like, what am I doing? And I just told them. And I would just say, hey, I'm reading this book, and it was talking about the root chakra deals with fear. And I would say, right now I'm working on my fears. And I was a very fearless individual. I thought I was fearless because being in the military, I had no problem jumping off of buildings. I had no problem. I was in the fight club at the time, and I had no problem standing in front of an auditorium. We call it the brass, the generals, and I had no problem with that, giving presentations and leading soldiers. Didn't care. But is that just because that's not what I was afraid of, and that's common fears for others, that didn't mean that I didn't have any fears. So I really had to dig deeply to see what I was actually afraid of. And what I was afraid of was truly being myself. I had put on this persona of what I thought people wanted me to be, or who I thought people wanted me to be. And I had to grow from that. And then as I started to work through that, I moved up to the next chakra, which is the sacral chakra, which deals with guilt and pleasure. And I had to figure out, why was I feeling guilty about certain things? And I realized I was a people pleaser. So there's a really jagged way of how I got to where I am today.
Yeah, very interesting. One thing you mentioned, and I always quite admire about your character, is you're extremely keen on knowledge. Obviously, even contemplating going for a PhD in neuroscience. One thing that many struggle with is this intersection between knowledge, sheer science, and spirituality. For you, how does they basically combine themselves to something worth pursuing?
Oh, for sure. So actually, what made it make the most sense for me is realizing that science and spirituality at one point were the same thing. And then there is a split, and now it's coming back together. So it kind of does this weird divergence, and it comes back. So when you look at all of our ancient, I say ancient, right? They weren't that old. But when we look at all of our scientists, such as like Galileo and Copernicus and Pythagoras. Pythagoras is one of my favorites. They were all considered mystical by a lot of their followers because, like Pythagoras of Soma, he was considered this mystic because of the way that he would utilize numbers and the way that he saw numbers allowed him to do these crazy calculations on the battlefield. Now, if we look at the rest of the population at the time, they just didn't understand math and science. So yeah, that would look like magic, right? Any significantly advanced enough technology is indistinguishable by magic from someone who's unaware of how that technology works. You know what I mean? Now, all of these individuals, all of these men, they were also very deeply devout in the church as well. So what happened historically was there's no big conspiracy on why, I haven't really found a conspiracy, I should say, on why science split from the church, why science split from spirituality. What I found historically is that basically there was a war. I forget which Roman king it was. And the university at the time, the university that Socrates started, it basically just got defunded because they decided to take the money from, which happens all the time, right? They took the money from the school and put it into the war. And Socrates was teaching about metaphysics and philosophy from a spiritual perspective. Got defunded, and we just never went back to that research. And this is where that split really started. So you had people who were followers of the metaphysical practices from these philosophers, and they were mathematicians. This is why they were spiritual and scientific. And then it kind of split because nobody was going to those universities anymore. They didn't exist. So nowadays we have this massive divergence, what appears to be a divergence in science and spirituality. This is kind of a long way around to answer the question.
This is very interesting, and I think this is a point towards owning in, because in many ways, and correct me if I'm wrong, but not only you believe that science and spirituality are intertwined, but they're simply factually, fundamentally intertwined, as they help us better understand life, better understand ourselves and the world, and therefore both of these facts should be not only pursue as a standalone basically path, but also as kind of like a an amalgam of what can be possible to achieve in this earth. And the one thing that is very interesting to me, and I love your definition on this, is when you're talking about spirituality, you also mentioned religion a few times. How do you distinguish between the two? What's your definition of both?
Oh yeah, for sure. So the biggest difference between spirituality and religion is that religions follow strict dogmatic practices where spirituality does not. Spirituality is about diving more deeply into the astral world, the mystical world, and getting closer to God in that respect. And God, from a spiritual perspective, is not a personified individual or a personified being. God is the all. God is everything that exists in our known and unknown reality. So when we look at the cross between spirituality and science, if we say that God is everything and we look at science, well, everything in our physical reality can basically be broken down to atoms. If you could zoom into literally anything in existence, it's just atoms. What is atoms? Atoms is just energy, right? So God is energy. God is this flow of energy that permeates throughout all of existence. So to study this form of energy would be to study God. And this is where that connection between science and spirituality happens. Now, the problem that science tends to have with spirituality is that we really don't have a way to study energy on that subatomic level. And this is before we dive into quantum physics, right? Because quantum physics is relatively nuanced. And even from a quantum physics perspective, we really don't know. There's a lot about quantum physics we don't know, right? Like literally there's something called like ghost particles that pass through our universe and they legit like disappear. It's crazy. So they're passing through our universe, they disappear and go somewhere, come back with more energy, and then they can charge other particles through quantum entanglement, right? But we're still learning more about quantum entanglement. But when we look at spirituality, there are certain aspects in spirituality, such as Reiki, where it talks about being able to heal people from a distance. The only way that you would be able to affect that you could heal someone from a distance, such as affecting the particles at a distance, would to be quantumly entangled with those particles. So if we start looking at, and we know that this is factual, we know this is true, right? Because we know that there have been studies done on monks who can meditate, and they've shown that the meditation can actually affect things at a distance. You don't actually have to be in the same room. It just takes a while for us as humans to learn to focus our minds. But this is where that intersection of science and spirituality started to come about. People say that there are certain aspects of spirituality that are pseudoscientific, but it's only pseudoscientific because it's challenging with our current form of technology to honestly replicate, consistently. And that's what science is from a modern day perspective. From a modern day perspective, it has to be able to be completely duplicatable in a closed environment. And to be honest, there are various aspects of spirituality that just aren't there. We're working on it though, and we as in like the people of the world.
Sure. If religion is the quest and the purpose of not only following but being as close as possible to God, otherwise known as theosis, for example, in Orthodox Christianity, in your words, what would you say is the purpose of spirituality, and how different is it to the purpose of religion itself?
So I would say that the purpose of spirituality is to find the divine within, and the purpose of religion is to find the divine without. So when we look at religion, a lot of times it's a divine individual that exists outside of yourself. And it's about getting closer to that divine individual. And this is where those dogmatic practices come from, because the dogmatic practices say that you have to do X, Y, Z in order to get close to this God or to this divine individual, right? But spirituality pretty much says the opposite. Spirituality says that no, everything is God, which means you are God, and there is a divine spark within you. So let's dive deeper and see how, let me teach you how to look inside to find that. And from my perspective, the reason why people are moving more towards spirituality and more away from religion is, as you get closer within the divine within yourself, you can't help but to see that divine within others, right? Because if you accept the fact that all of us are a part of the divine spark, you would give the same amount of reverence that you would give to a deity outside of yourself to literally everybody, because we all have that spark inside of us, right? And you recognize it in yourself, so you can recognize it in another individual. This is why, and also there's a lot of negative connotations that comes with religion. And not that there's anything bad with any religion, right? So all religions help people. I kind of get in I have this whole soapbox about spiritualists who say that, oh, religion is bad. I'm like, no, it's not. There's nothing wrong with following any religion. Right? So the negative connotation seems to come from people having these belief systems saying that my religion is right and your religion is wrong. So that's a lot of where the negative connotations come from. So people tend to move over to spirituality because of that as well. Because spirituality says that no, we're all on the same quest to get closer to the divine, and that can look differently. So we kind of accept that there's, multiple ways to get there. There's not just one path. There's not just one journey. And there's also the logical perspective that in some religions, it is say that if you don't follow this particular religion, you're going to go to a not so great place. But what if you were never exposed to that? There are parts around the world that were never exposed to these different religions. So you're telling me that they are inherently going to go somewhere else because they could not have known? That really doesn't make sense. It makes more sense that there are multiple ways to get to this end destination.
So in many ways, religion can be quite adversary in different profit, different ways of exerting basically your quest to God. would you say that in your personal opinion, spirituality could be a fantastic way to promote unity, to promote this, well, quite fundamental quest of life, which is peace and love for all? Would you say it will play a major part in that quest in the decades to come?
Yeah, 100%. But also, though, what tends to lead me in spirituality, and I think a lot of others, and this is a lot of what I talk about with people as well. When I was diving, before I got into spirituality, I did look up and research various religions and various theologies. They all ultimately talk about the same thing. So they all ultimately lead you down the path of love and getting connected with people. It's just
100%.
that when you're on this path from a religious perspective, it makes it seem as if you have to be a part of that religion to get there. So that's why I say that there's nothing wrong with the religion. We're all ultimately going to get to the same place. It's just that from a spiritual, purely spiritual perspective, is we accept the fact that we're all going to get there and it doesn't really matter how we get there. We're all going to make it there. It's all about love. It's all about unity. It's all about supporting one another and growing from that perspective, right? Like I said earlier, we all have that divine spark within ourselves. So once you start to see it and start to feel it within you, you just want to help others. And I'm not saying that that doesn't happen in religion, because it does. And I have plenty of friends who are religious. A lot of my friends are Christian, you know, and they still want to help. It's just that a lot of my Christian friends will say, you should just come to church with me, which is fine. I'll go to church with them. I have no problem with that, you know.
Sure.
And, they should say, you should just go to church with me and let's talk about that. But when I start talking about God, it can be kind of we kind of hit an impasse, because when I talk about God, I really do talk about nature and about the all and about everything being connected. I don't see how there can be a physical being, a physical personification of a being that is passing judgment upon others. Because if God, from the religious perspective, is all about love and light, then first of all, why would a divine being have any type of personified emotions and stuff like that anyway, right? Because that's a very human construct, very human idea. And that's limiting a divine being to what we think consciousness should be. But consciousness is a whole nother thing, you know? But why would a divine being want to do that? Or why would a divine being do that? But spirituality says that no, there really isn't a one form of a being. In order to be everything, you have to literally be everything. In order to be a god, you have to be a part of everything. And spirituality, let's move it away from saying spirituality. I feel like it kind of gets a little redundant. But like in metaphysics, we start talking about how every single atom, every single aspect, every single spark is so intertwined that when we go out, we can actually feel the emotions of others. And we say this all the time. It's just that people don't really talk about it, right? Because we're like, oh, I get a bad vibe from that person, or oh, I get a great vibe from this individual. Oh, I met you and I just really enjoyed being around you, even though we spoke for 5 seconds, you know? So like, you really do start to feel this vibrational energy, because to get a vibe from something or someone, it's short for vibration, right? So you really do start to feel that vibrational connection with between you and I, and between others, and between nature, if you open yourself up to do so, if you become more mindful and become more aware. So that's really what spirituality talks about.
Yeah, that happens to me all the time. By the way, I can typically tell if I'm gonna like somebody in, I'd say, 2 to 5 minutes, very 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 quickly. You talk about this concept of the divine spark. I hear it mentioned twice in this conversation this far. Obviously, as your interpretation is that everybody possess that divine spark, where do you think that comes from? I suppose we're born with it, but I suppose spiritually or philosophically speaking, where do you think that comes from?
Ooh, from a philosophical perspective, I would say that that comes from source, right?
Yeah.
And what is source is really the crux of the question. So source is everything that has a beginning has an ending, and everything that has an ending has a beginning, right? As above, so below. I just have to start with that for myself, and what source is the source of reality, the source of existence, the source of consciousness. So the way that I heard it best many years ago is that it doesn't matter where or when it started, because when source came into existence, there would have been nothing before that. So there would have been no existence. This is where like we get gnosis and knowledge from, right? So there was literally nothing before that. There was no up, there was no down, no left, no right. So imagine, if you can, or if you will, that for whatever reason, there was the spark. Something came into existence and decided that it wanted to exist. We don't know what that is, don't know what that was, and we probably never will, you know? And it's just, as from a human, we just simply couldn't understand that. There is no space, there is no time. So in order to create reality itself, this spark, this idea needs to create something around it. So the first thing you need to create is the first dimension, and you need to create space. How do you do that? You would have to take yourself, because you're the only thing that exists, and extend yourself in every direction. So now we extend ourselves and say that I'm going to go forward, and to create forward, you instantly create backwards. I want to go up, and once you create up, you create down, and you extend yourself in all directions. It doesn't matter how far you extend yourself, because at this point, there are no units of measurement. So it could have been 3,000 miles. It could have been 2 inches. It doesn't actually matter, right? So how do you feel that void? Well, in order to feel the void, and now you stretch yourself in every direction. So in order to feel this void, you have to actually start moving. And to move, you have to rotate yourself. And this is why when you look back into hieroglyphs and look back into some of the symbology, the first symbol is actually a dot, is a period. The second symbol is a line. And then if you were to take the line, then you move it, you get like a cross. And if you were to spin it, you would get a sphere, right? Because a cross and lines in every direction in a two-dimensional plane looks like a circle. But once you spin it, it becomes a sphere, and it enters the third dimension. So now we can actually create space. And once we start moving that space around, we start creating structure, right? And then as this particle, which is now a spherical ball of light energy, as that starts to move around and create structure within this space, every time that particle moves, it exists at a different time, right? So we could actually say that the particle moved from point A to B. In order to calculate that, we have to put a time placement on it. So now we entered a new dimension, saying that we have we have the position, space, time, and we can also start to calculate velocity based off of the movement and speed of that. There's actually a rule that says you can't calculate the position and speed of a particle at the same time, because the second you start to calculate the position of the particle, it would have moved somewhere else in order for you to have something relative to calculate to in the first place, right? So when I talk about the divine spark, what I'm saying is this thought, this idea, that energy that did not exist and does exist is still ultimately moving to create more structure and to create more molecules. And we are those structures. We are those molecules. This is why our universe is constantly expanding, because that divine spark is still replicating itself and pushing out further.
Does that goes until infinity? What's your take on how that extend?
It definitely goes into our current concept of infinity. One of my friends is actually a mathematician, and he introduced me to infinity plus one, and he showed me that there are multiple types of infinity. I'm also not a mathematician, so I don't want to dive too deeply into that math specifically, but ultimately it would go on forever, and it would go on into eternity. One thing that I find very fascinating is we seem to think, it's the hubris of man is what I call it. We seem to think that we are this anomaly that exists, in the universe. Our galaxy is young compared to many other galaxies. I mean, the Andromeda system, there's so many other galaxies that exist that are billions of times larger than ours. We're not even at the center of our own mapped universe. So why would there not be, you know, other sparks of this divine that exist out there? And as our universe continuously expands, we just simply we can't calculate that. There's, according to our current laws of physics and our current mathematics and stuff like that, how would you be able to calculate that? Now, to say that, from my perspective, yes, it's going to go on into infinity, it's going to go on to eternity, but there's also the philosophical side of me that says that everything that has a beginning has an ending. So if it started, then it has to end at some point. But I have my own theories on time. And my thought process is that it's not that it would particularly end. It would just continuously start to map itself. If we continue with this analogy or metaphor about the divine spark being a molecule that's replicating itself and creating structure. So it would continuously map itself within that structure. And the only thing that structure could do is duplicate itself again. And by duplicating itself, it would create another universe. But this gets into like multiversal theory and stuff like that, right? So if the totality of the divine spark got to a point where it had mapped itself in its entirety, now it would become the totality of that piece, that spark, that universe, and then it would have to create a duplicate of itself.
Yeah, no, we're entering fun territory here. So, if that divine spark, like we said, can not only be unfathomable when it comes to human minds, it's simply either too complex or too extensive for us to understand. Basically, how the sheer length, the sheer complexity of that concept. Do you believe there's other forms of life elsewhere?
I believe that, yes. And I'd say that yes very definitively, only because it doesn't make sense to me for there not to be, right? But put that aside, because that's my own personal, really short version of the answer. The long version of that answer is we actually don't know how life got started on Earth. Every reasoning that people give, there are three main theories on how life got started, and they're all still technically theories. And panspermia is one of those, you know. So regardless if you say, now when we say life, I assume you mean complex life and life that we would perceive to have consciousness, right? Because we know that there is like bacteria that exists. You know what I mean? Like you can find it on like I'm also not an astrophysicist, but you could there's going to be like small single-celled organisms that exist somewhere, especially on planets that have like water. So that wouldn't be too surprising.
Yeah, that's actually a guarantee. There's single basically cells life elsewhere. Anything that have actually water component must have must have bacteria in them.
Right.
That being said, when you were thinking about a species to our extent, we're perhaps far greater than us.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that is very interesting to me, as well as I research history, is we obviously, as human beings, we think that we're super important because we're super important to us. But how does that intertwine to the reality of life elsewhere? Not only the sheer numbers of galaxies, which are in the billions that we currently know of. Therefore, there's absolutely more than that. That's basically the minimum that we're playing with. To me, this idea of exclusive life on Earth seems more and more like let's say a childish understanding of the world. Would you say so?
I 100% agree with that. I also think it's childish to believe that life has to exist in a form that is similar to ours, because
Sure.
we tend to think that, cause we call it the Goldilocks zone, right? We're like, oh, we find a planet that's in the Goldilocks zone, then there might be uh, humanoid type of beings on that planet. Well, why is it that there has to be a carbon-based being that exists on other planets in the first place? You know what I mean? Because when we say that they're humanoid, what we're really saying is that they have a carbon-based structure and they have maybe a structure that's similar to ours with our 2 legs and 2 arms and bipedal and stuff like that. That's no guarantee. And one of my first experiences with this, not with like extraterrestrials and stuff, but as far as there being life on other planets, was when I first came across the Drake equation. And I was like, we know that there's many planets, and because of how many planets there are theoretically in the universe, and we calculate how many have to have a sun that's similar to ours, and we calculate the amount of planets with those suns that have to have planets that are in the Goldilocks zone, then there have to be X amount of planets that have supportable life on them. Now, if we also take into account that those planets are in galaxies so far away from us that are so much older than ours is, it would make sense that even if we applied our same timeline of technological advancement to other planets, galaxies away from us, they would be centuries, if not millennia, ahead of us from a technological standpoint. And this is based everything off of finding planets that are in the Goldilocks zone that probably have humanoid type beings that exist in galaxies that we know are older than ours.
Yeah, I believe we've been brainwashed somehow from Hollywood and movies and so on, because every single time they think of other life form, they're always somewhat similar to us. Look at the Martians and so on; they're very humanoid in basically nature. But like you said, other complex life form could be something absolutely nothing like us. They could be I don't know, 10 meters basically tall with some type of a very complex basically structure that is not skin and flesh. So it could be very much more creative, or perhaps our understanding of what creative life is. Obviously, as human beings, one thing I want to ask you is, for you, the human obviously experience, as you said, is more normal than normality. We believe so because we're human beings, but basically contemplating other forms of life, even basically on Earth, animals and so on, we tend to understand that there's the very 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 similar concept that apply to basically all form of life, outside of the human life on Earth as well. When you're thinking of that divine spark and how that intertwine with life itself, sometimes I tend to, when I'm having profound conversation like this one, I tend to feel small, feel let's say empowered by the fact that we're truly just a grain of salt in a just floating humongous planet, mainly composed of water, just going around a fireball, and that keeps us basically at the right temperature so that human life is possible. It's just a miracle. Let's be very honest. It's nothing short of a miracle. How can you derive a sense of meaning and purpose, in your opinion, when you have this extent of an understanding about life, and how perhaps inessential you truly are?
Oh, interesting. So I'll keep it with your salt analogy. And if you were, being that I worked in a medical hospital as a medical technologist, right? If your sodium level is just slightly low, you need to go to the hospital. So every grain of salt is just as important as the cave of salt, right? Every drop of water is just as important as any other drop of water in the ocean. That drop of water, if you put it under a microscope, there are so many organisms that you can see, right? So our existence, it can be very easy to kind of get wrapped up in the whole, there's no point to this existence. From my perspective, the point in our existence is that, one, you are important. We are important as individuals, but to spread the love and to spread the knowledge, to spread the wealth and to spread health, you know? So when we start looking at the all the animals and everything on our planet, there's something I want to say about that. But when we start looking at all the animals and all the other species that just exist on our planet, as we are literally a rock in a bubble floating around a fireball, like you said, which is a miracle. I had a rabbi on my show, and he was talking about that. He was just like, "That's we don't realize how much of a miracle our life and our existence is.
No doubt.
Just to be here. I mean, for you to be born, there are millions of sperm cells that could have made it, and you're the one that made it. And there are countless cases of babies being born, stillborn, but you were not one of those. You know, any moment, at any moment, at any time of the day, your life could be quote unquote cut short, right? But it isn't. So go live your life to the fullest. You are important. You have no idea the impact you have on people just by smiling at them. You know what I mean? Like, I think people take that for granted. When someone's having a bad day, you can literally change their entire world, change their life around. I've had people, this is why one of the reasons why I really got into doing what I do is because I started having people come up to me, telling me that they were going to take their life had they not spoken to me. It was something that I said, and I was like, oh my God, really? I was just talking, and you really don't know the level of impact you have on people. We are so much more powerful than we're led to believe. Your words can create and destroy. This is why in mindfulness, we talk about truly being mindful of everything. How do you talk to people? How do you approach people? Because you could destroy a person by saying the smallest thing, but you could also uplift them by giving them some words of wisdom. That's not just a grain of salt, But again, going back to the salt analogy, you drop 1 grain of salt into an open wound, it really hurts.
It's so interesting because truly, whoever controls what you think, control who you are, and this concept that I heard very, very often, which is if you understood the full extent of the power of your thoughts, you would never had a negative one ever again. It's always very interesting because, and I want to dive deeper into self-identity. I think your journey through not only overcoming basically depressions and that void and filling that void with what it seems to be meaning is extraordinary, but I think can be very insightful as well. One thing that I believe to be true is the true you is not who you think you are. It's basically not who I think I am. It's not who you think I am. It's who I think you think I am. So that basically, that third perspective is so important as it shapes our world. It shapes our reality. When it comes to what you did to embrace your own self in a very meaningful manner, tell us more about a couple of the strategy you found to unveil who you truly are and perhaps let the world be able to enjoy the person you are and the quest you have. How is that? How perhaps does that unfold for you?
Oh, for sure. So what I did, and I actually tell people to do this as well. I teach people to honestly take themselves out of their comfort zone. So as far as the strategy that I give, the first thing you need to do is be honest with yourself. If you're having these thoughts, these conversations with yourself, because this is an internal dialogue that we're talking about, right? About wanting to grow, about recognizing that there's a problem, recognizing that there's a void. That's where you start at. Now you have to find what that is. So take yourself out of your comfort zone, do something different. If you don't normally go for a walk, go for a walk. If you normally eat this type of food, eat another type of food. This is actually how I cleaned up my diet. Was I fasted I actually fasted for about 3 or 4 days, and I slowly reintroduced food into my system. And there were some things that just started hurting my body, and then I realized those are the things that I didn't need to do. So just change it up. So from a diet perspective, fasting and then reintroduce food, but from a finding your interest perspective. So how I actually got on my journey with starting the business and want to help people and talk to people is I just started getting out, talking, and I found that this is what I like. I'm sure people have heard follow your bliss or follow your passion, you know? you can only find what your passion is, only find what your bliss is if you literally start experimenting with people. My partner and I, when we first met, I was like, let's take a vacation. Let's go travel. And I was like, where do you want to go? I learned my partner had never been anywhere, never gone anywhere outside of Arizona. So I
Wow.
was getting frustrated because I was asking you where you want to go. So I talked to my sister about it. And she said, well, perhaps having never gone anywhere, there's nothing to relate that to. So you really have to go out and experience things before you can say whether you do or don't like them, and do that within reason. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean to go out and put yourself in harm's way, but it means that how do you know if you don't like it if you don't experience it? You have people who get stuck in uh, these routines, a 9 to 5 job that they hate. You don't even know why you don't like your job because it might not be the fact that you're not making enough money, which is what people usually say, right? It might be the fact that you actually enjoy what you're doing, but you're missing out on time with your family. So how do we change that around to where you're doing what you're doing, but you're doing what you enjoy doing at your job, but we can give you some more time to be with your family because there are other aspects. It's not always just about money, so you really want to start with figuring out what the problem is, and then we can actually address it. But if you don't know what the problem is, you have to put yourself into a situation to kind of shake things up.
Yeah, the comfort zone. So it's a very interesting concept. We talk. Obviously, I've been an athlete my whole life, so we talk about that comfort zone or focus zone very, very often. To me, any high performer must be able to step out of their comfort zone for many reasons. I think the one thing that is very interesting philosophy wise is Nietzsche. Nietzsche said the true problem of the modern world is that we believe suffering is meaningless, and he basically goes on with an incredible thesis, one of the best writer of all time, obviously by a mile, and he's talking about the concept that actually it's impossible to embrace a meaningful life without suffering. And the concept of suffering, and when you're thinking about suffering, don't think about physically injuring yourself. It may be such thing, but it's more on a spiritual level. It's more on a mental level. How can you make sure that you overcome your past self? You basically overpower your own self to a better version of it. When you're talking about these concepts spiritually, you talk a lot about mindfulness, meditations, finding yourself. What would you say if you had to advise your depressed self when I don't know how long that it's been, how many years ago basically that was, but if you could tell them one thing to keep going and to keep chasing this perhaps more meaning in their life, what would it be?
Oh, it's so cliche, but it's going to be okay. you know, and I would I would start it with that. But one thing that's really and it still helps me to this day is you're not as behind as you think you are.
Mhm.
So when I was angry and depressed, I kept thinking that not only was there something wrong with me, but the problems that I was having, I should not be having those problems. And I feel like we tend to do that just throughout our lives. I'm too old for this. I shouldn't be having this problem at my age. I should be over it. No, it's okay. You're not as behind as you think you are, and there's nobody to compare yourself to aside from who you were yesterday. Because as long as you made one step forward, then you're ahead. You're doing better. So just sitting, if I, me, my situation, if I could honestly go back and talk to myself, I would say something like that, but that's not what I needed at the time. And what I really
Mhm.
needed at the time was a hug. I really just needed somebody to just sit there with me and sit in silence with me. And that's not something that I had. A lot of times what I would do, I remember sitting in the barracks and I would go sit in the laundry room because nobody sits in the laundry room, right? So I would go sit in the laundry room and I would just write, because I didn't have anybody to talk to. And I have people that I talk to and that I work with where sometimes that's all they need as well. You know, Sometimes in meditation, I do guided meditations as well, but I've had people who just want someone to sit there with them. and that's okay too.
Yeah, that sharing conversation can go very, very far. And thinking it's something that you seem to be doing more than most people. Let's be honest. I think that it's Henry Ford that said thinking is the hardest thing there is. That's why so few engage in it. And 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 truly thinking is extremely powerful, not just for your own sake, but for shaping reality, the metaphysics, like you called it. Let me bring you back to business and this act of service you're currently basically involving yourself within. When you were able to juggle mindfulness, meditation, finding yourself, spirituality, how did that come as a whole to monetize it as a business? What was that course and that process like?
That was a real challenge. I had no idea to turn to for it. So, but the whole process was when I went to make it into a business. First, like I said, I started with creating physical products.
Mm-hmm.
So really what I did, what I still do, is I want to give people the things that I wanted. So when I started the products, I created those because what I wanted was on the market. And if I wanted it, I just assumed other people would want it as well, which is accurate, right? Because if one person wants it, we look how many people there are. There's, you know, 1,000, 10,000, million other people that probably want something similar. So that's really where the products themselves came from. As far as wanting to help people and sit down and have conversations, one-on-ones and the show and meditations and stuff like that, I just want to give people a shortcut to the information that took me years to get, you know?
Mm.
So when I decided I wanted to have a one-on-one with people, it was I kind of have an idea of what you're looking for because that's what I was looking for. And it always starts with a conversation, right? It starts with this is what, or what are you looking for? What's going on in your life? Blah, blah. Okay. Well, the thing about being in the position that I'm in, I'm sure this happens with you as well as a marketer, you're able to see things and see gaps that other people aren't, excuse me. And because you can see those gaps, it makes it easier for you to make the connections. And even though I can see your beginning and your ending, you might not be able to see it. And I can see the positions in between. And it might seem like a slow road for you, but it seems like a slow road for you from your perspective. But to me, this is the fastest way. This is what took me years to do is gonna take you weeks or a few months. And there's also no quick fix to anything. And I think that people need to get that out of their head. But to answer your question about monetization, I think you and I had a conversation about this a while ago, but I wasn't really looking at making a ton of money at first. And for me, it's not really about the money. The money will come. And I just truly
Yeah.
believe that. I've always believed that the money will come. It's all about helping people. It's all about the exchange of energy. And energy in our current society comes in the form of finances and physical wealth. So when we start talking about the exchange of energy and me helping you, me giving you my time and showing you the path and the way, or if there is such a thing, right? So that's a energetic transfer. And the way that you would show your appreciation with that is from a financial standpoint. But this isn't new. This has been going on for centuries. All of your um, I was gonna say priests and monks and healers. Not that I would consider myself as such, but like it's always been like that. It wasn't. It's just that our current form of energy is in the form of the finances. But you would always give what you could, to get that assistance, to get that help. You
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't go to someone and ask them for help, and even though they might not specifically ask you for something in return, it's within your core to do something in return because most of us have this inner feeling of you helped me, I want to help you in some type of way,
Reciprocation. Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me put it this way: the cheaper your desires, the richer you will be. Very,
Mm,
very famous Buddhism quote. And when you're thinking of this on a metaphysical mindfulness level, how are you able to teach yourself to embrace the long game? Right, you just said it very well, which is I didn't start this for the money, which I truly believe you. But how, with all the desires and with all of what we see nowadays in the modern world, young people obviously making it to the highest stages, Lamborghinis, lavish lifestyle, and so on. How do you teach yourself to embrace and accept the long game instead of a sour taste and what can be truly an evil take on what it needs and what it takes to make it in business? Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, honestly, I never really looked at it that way. So I never looked at it as playing the long game. I never looked at it as this is going to take, 10, 15, 20, 30 years or something. I look at it as it takes as long as it needs to. Time
Mm.
is relative. I never really looked at time as it's not like a finite construct. This is just the work that needs to be done in our society at this time, right now. And I am willing to be a part of that process. I truly believe that if I wasn't doing it, then somebody else would, and that's okay. But I would like to be a part of it. I want to help. And if it takes me the rest of my life to get to uh, a place to where I can pass that torch on, because that's ultimately what's going to happen eventually, right? So if
Mm.
it takes me the rest of my life, then it takes me the rest of my life. I don't think that the way that I see our world, the way that I see our society is a place where everybody has such a deep level of connectedness that what we perceive as our problems and we perceive as negativities are non-existent. I see a place where we help each other just grow. I see a place where we don't need to do these harsh jobs. We don't do things that make us depressed, you know? And I see a place where my goal right now is to create a facility for people to come to when they make that transition, you know? And however long that takes, it takes as long as it takes. I don't know that our society is gonna make it there in my lifetime, and I'm
Mm.
okay with that. I that would be like saying from a technological standpoint, I want to be the person to create teleportation, you know, and which I actually started working on an equation for it some years back. I call it quantum mass displacement, and the reality of it is, would it be great to create that in my lifetime? Sure. But if it doesn't happen in my lifetime, that's fine. When we look at people like Elon Musk, who's trying to put people on Mars, is that going to happen in his lifetime? Or is he creating the foundation for us to terraform and to get to other planets? It's really about being okay with being the person that lays the brick, but not being the person that sleeps in the house.
Right. Newton said the reason why I was able to become so great is I was able to stand on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
And when you're thinking about this liaison between the visionaries and the doers, like you said, perhaps I won't be the one achieving basically that quest, but may my may my may my own journey be the foundation to that final objective. I think that's extraordinary. I think that's very, very insightful. Um, when you're thinking of that quest, and you just said something very interesting that I want to rebound on, which is you believe in a world where we don't need to do the basically hard labor or anything that makes us depressed anymore. You believe that there's a way in which we can embrace probably technology. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but embrace basically different ways of doing things so that human beings can fulfill their true social and creative basically states. How do you see that happen? Tell me more about that vision that you have of it basically coming to fruition.
Yeah, for sure. So, it's funny because when you and I were talking about this the other day, I was 100% on board with AI and about technology. And I think that a lot of times people who are in my position as far as metaphysics, philosophy, and spirituality are concerned tend to shy away from technology. And I'm like, no, it's a gift, it's a tool, you know, because if we truly are from our own perspectives as spiritualists, want people to dive deeper into themselves. The fact of the matter is we need to free up the time for them to do so. A lot of times the reason why people don't get into metaphysics, philosophy, and spirituality, you just don't have the time to do it. You have families, you have lives, you got to put food on the table, keep a roof over your head. Now, imagine that we have the technology, we have artificial intelligence that's at a point to where we don't have to do all of those things. We don't have to get out there and physically grind every day. We can all find a way to sustain ourselves with as little physical effort as possible. And once we do that, that allows us to take our lives straight, completely from a physical material perspective, and start really diving internally and start looking at what it means to get closer to the all. But in order to do that, we have to remove these blocks. We have to remove everything that's going to stop us from getting there. And from a physical perspective, that looks like technology, right? Because the reason why we have this shift in consciousness the way that we do right now, the reason why we're going through a paradigm shift is because of technology. People simply just didn't have the time on their hands, 100, 200, 300 years ago to sit here and contemplate this. You literally had to go out there and till the land. You don't have
Exactly.
time to
No,
contemplate life.
absolutely. And I think that's one that we discuss very often with each other, and I think with the world, is when you're thinking of the pyramid of Maslow, right? When you're thinking of philosophical basically needs all the way to self-fulfillment, self-improvements, you're exactly right. We now live in a world where truly it was in about less than 100 years, we went from most people having basically industry job, driving basically very, very tough jobs, and typically in mines, typically obviously in basically industry, gas industry, cars industry, and so on, military industry, and so on. Everything was man-made in a way in which was not only time consuming but extremely counterproductive to self-fulfillment. 14, 15-hour jobs with traps of dying everywhere because everything was quite unsafe, everything was hard to accomplish. Now we live in this in a time where monetization can be done on autopilots. When your quests of fulfilling your basic needs can be quite effectively achievable. Nothing is easy, but simpler, no doubt. I think there's no debate. There's no debating that. Do you think? Let me ask you a profound question. Do we think that we once had a higher mindfulness and we lost it in exchange of an endless pursuit of the material world, and now just start to realize and kind of like reclaim the fact that actually we're sadder, we're more depressed, even though our world is simple, we must be missing something, and the world is reshifting towards this understanding of the higher power of spirituality, of embracing a better self and not just material possessions. In histories of mankind, do you think such thing occur, or is just a natural evolution?
Interesting. So after doing a ton of reading on this subject, what I've kind of come to is that at one point, it seems that there were people on the planet there were greater levels of consciousness on the planet. There was greater levels of technology. It was just a different form of technology that we have right now, but there were high levels of technology, and then it all got wiped out, right? So where this comes from, the reading that I'm talking about from the ancient texts would be like the Bhagavad Gita, Mahabharata, but also when you read the Bible, right? So it actually talks about, the Bible starts with Genesis and it starts with the Great Flood. Well, when
Yep.
you read the Mahabharata, it actually ends at the Great Flood. So it's almost like there's this
Interesting.
prehistory that happens before the Bible starts, and then you have this history that happens after. But then when you read the Mahabharata, they start talking about these wars that was going on, and they describe these advanced weaponry. You can't have advanced weaponry without having advanced technology, right? So we start to learn that there is a history before what we've kind of been taught. And then we move on to our modern day history. So yes, there seems like there was this rise in technology, rise in consciousness. and then this massive drop, this massive fall. And then it seems as if we're coming back up. Now, from my perspective and what I've kind of learned about the way the universe works, and our lives do this as well, right? Our everyday lives. When we are on our journey through life, we hit peaks. We also fall off those peaks. The thing that tends to happen with us, especially people who are go-getters, we'll hit a peak and then we'll drop. But then the next peak is always higher
Right.
than the previous one. And we're going to
Yes.
fall again, and that's okay, because then the next peak is going to be higher than that previous one. So when we look at that from a consciousness perspective, like, yes, we were at a peak of consciousness before. We're just coming out of that drop, and then we're going to hit a higher level peak. When we dive into what's called the yugas, we're exiting what was the Kali Yuga, which is actually the drop in humanity consciousness. And we're actually entering the golden age of consciousness, if you will. We're entering a level to where what we've been talking about for at least the past 10 or 15 minutes about, we won't have to do the mundane work anymore. We'll be able to truly move inside to do the conscious work. When we look back before, when the consciousness was high, there was still a high population of people that had to do the physical mundane work, and not enough people that was able to carry us over from a humanity perspective to that next level of consciousness. Now, there's no real, all of that I just said, there's no real backing behind that. That comes from reading a ton of different books from a bunch of different sources. You know what I mean?
Right.
But it does seem, when you just open your eyes and look around, it seems like that's what's happening. We physically found artifacts that just don't make sense, right? We found ancient technology that don't make sense. Like, we can't explain it. So we know that there was, at some point, some high level technology on the planet. We know that there were priests who were high consciousness, high functioning, and they had their followers. And we also know that when we're reading the Bible, they talk about these other deities. They actually don't talk about demons in the Bible. They talk about the other gods, and it says you won't worship the other gods, but it doesn't say anything about them being devils, about them being demons and stuff like that. It's really interesting, So what that means to me is that those are just higher levels of consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting because I use the climbing a mountain basically analogy. When you're at the peak of a mountain, basically now you see the world from another perspective, from an elevated basically perspective. So you always tend to see a mountain that is even higher than the one you're currently on, and therefore that's why when you're climbing it, you seem to be shortly for a quick amount of time, basically I suppose declining or getting back from basically the peak that you had, because now you're climbing something at a higher level, right? It's always this. It's always a matter of perspective. It's also reminding me of a incredible quote, one of my favorite quote of all time, which is, "You should always shoot at the moon, because even if you missed it, you winds up in the stars," right? And when you're having this mindset, this winning mindset, truly everything's happened for a reason, and it actually, probably realistically speaking, doesn't. But that's not why you should believe such thing. You should believe such thing for your own sake, for the sake of peace, for the sake of self-improvement, and therefore obviously bettering the world through it. So one thing that is very interesting on what you discuss with the basically discussions of, you should worship our God and not other gods, not because they're evil, not because they're evil in any means, not because they're demons, but because we basically believe God or XYZ prophet to be the one leading us to the highest good, to the promised land, perhaps the best way to look at it, or heaven even. When you're thinking of life on earth, what's heaven for Dexter Morton?
Heaven is a place where you find peace and bliss, and whatever peace and bliss and happiness means for you at that time. And the reason why I phrase it that way is, what I perceive as heaven and what you perceive as heaven, two different things, which is why when you say, what is heaven for you, right? But also, what I perceive as heaven might be different than what I perceive as heaven in like 5 years. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Because what makes me happy today might not be what makes me happy, tomorrow or next year or something like that. Some may call that fickle. I call it growth because our awareness of what's going on around us changes. We need to be able to expand. We need to be able to grow deeper into our own happiness, into our own bliss. You know what I mean? At one point in my life, I found happiness at the bottom of a bottle, you know? And now in my life, I find happiness and joy by sharing that happiness and joy with others, you know? So for me, heaven is a place where there's truly just love and blissful energy just everywhere. Uh, I feel that heaven is also on earth. And I know that's also cliche. I wasn't going to say that, but heaven really is on earth. When you look around, the world is so beautiful. Can a painter really capture the imagery of the forest? You know, when you take a picture of a sunset, does the picture really tell 1,000 words? Because you had to have been there, you know? So our planet is so wonderful. It's so beautiful. Our universe is so beautiful. I don't imagine that heaven itself, if there's a different plane of existence that's like higher or something like that, I don't really imagine that it's that drastically different. I honestly would imagine that if there is another plane of existence that we could call heaven, it's probably very similar to this. And the only difference is the level of which we're able to dive into our feelings, our emotions, and manifest at that level because things are more wispy, if you will, more whimsical.
Perhaps heaven is elsewhere, but we have some glimpse of it. Mr. Dexter Morton, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. An extraordinary conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Sam. I've really enjoyed my time.
Any last words for our audience?
Oh, any last words? Honestly, just follow your bliss. Find what makes you happy and go after it. And don't let that nagging feeling of, I can't do it, I'm not going to make it, hold you back because you can. It's going to be okay. And once you start on that path and that journey, I promise you're going to find the support you need. It's going to be like magic.
Thank you for spending your time with us today on the Meaningful Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review or share it with someone who could benefit from it. And always remember, your story matters. Make it meaningful. We hope to see you next time.